According to him, myth is language, and to understand myth, it has to be told. But it is it is simultaneously both language and it is something different from it. And he says this is similar to Sochaux's distinction between langue and parole, because in page 209 he says that Sochaux's distinction between langue and parole, one being the structural side of language, the other the statistical aspect of it. He examines language as langue, and he believes that this becomes like the basic structure of language, and this can be applied to any kind of language, and meaning can be created out of these cultural signs. Now he has applied this theory of langue and parole to the study of language, and he has also used the same technique in the study of the kinship system, as well as in the structural study of mythology as well. Now, Levi Strauss insists that myth is a language and it has to be told in order to exist. Unless you are told what a particular myth is, you do not really understand. So it performs like a language. And he says the langue, it belongs to what he calls a revisable time, and parole belongs to what he calls non-revisable type, meaning langue can exist in the past, the present and future, since it is a structure itself. But parole, it exists in the linear time, in that you cannot actually turn the clock back. But here when you study a myth, in the study of myth, you find that a myth is both historically specific. Now this is what he's trying to say. It is both historically specific, and that it is always set sometime long ago. At the same time, it is ahistorical, which is that it is that its story is timeless. Now here you can refer to page 209, the example that has been given of the French Revolution. Now when the historians, they think about French Revolution, they always think about it in a sequence of past happenings, like it is non-reversible. It's something that has happened, it cannot be changed, and its consequence can be still felt right now. But if you ask a French politician as well as his followers, now they would say that the French Revolution is it is a continuation of the past. All right, and to a historian, it is a timeless, which can be detected in the contemporary social structure as well. So now he gives you this example for you to understand how a myth functions. Now he says, now you find that it's a double structure, just like this French Revolution. It uses simultaneously both these patterns, that is it is historical as well as ahistorical. And he says this is how a myth too would function. So now myth is both historical and ahistorical at one and the same time. Taken as history, it will be parole, as it will be told in an irreversible time, and as an irreversible time if it is a langue, because it has the property of being timeless. But now there is also a third level, a third referent that rules the mythology, and it is the property of being absorptive. Now it is a property of malleability. It is extremely malleable. So he says the myth can be translated, it can be reduced, it can be paraphrased, expanded. And now I'm quoting Claggs here. Now he says myth can be translated, reduced, paraphrased, expanded and manipulated without losing its basic shape or structure. And he says myth can be translated in any language. It can be translated into any language without you losing its basic elements, and it can be reduced to certain elements. It can be expanded by some more additions, but the basic idea, the basic, I would say, the structure, it never loses its basic function and structure. And all these so called alterations or changes or additions that are made to myths does not really do much damage to the basic idea of a myth. Now, this is very different from all the other cases that in terms of language, because if there is any change in the lung and parole, there will be a complete change in the basic function and structure. Now, this is why myth cannot be compared to a language. It is language because it has to be performed, it has to be told like language. So in that particular manner, if you look at it, then you can say that myth is language. But is it simply language? No, it is much more than language, because it has a third reference, meaning it is much more than works on a higher plane, and that is why it is different. Now again, page 210, he says, let me kind of make it bigger. He says, myth is the part of language where the formula traditor and traditore reaches its lowest truth value. Now he's talking about translation and the translator. And he says, from that point of view, it should be placed in the gamut of literary expressions at the end opposite to that of poetry, in spite of all the claims which have been made to prove the contrary. Poetry is a kind of speech which cannot be translated except at the cost of serious distortions. Because whenever you try to translate it, you do the, I would say, you would make the mistake of distorting what has been said in poetry. Whereas the mythical value of the myth is preserved. You can translate it, anything can be done to it. So even if it is badly translated or if it is translated well, either way you find that the value of the myth still remains. So whatever our ignorance of the language and the culture of the people where it originated, a myth is still felt as a myth by any reader anywhere in the world. Its substance does not lie in its style, its original music or its syntax, but in the story which it tells. Myth is language functioning on as an especially high level where meaning succeeds practically at taking off from the linguistic ground on which it keeps on rolling. So here he talks about this special characteristic of myth, and Levi Strauss reveals it by talking about its translatability. Now, unlike any other form of language, and especially poetry, which loses a lot in translation, myth retains its capacity, even when it is poorly translated. Now, Levi Strauss says, now this translatability, this malleability is due to the nature of the structural components which actually make up this myth, which are irreducible and recurrent across myths. Now, he says, to sum up the discussion at this point, we have so far made the following claims. Now, he makes three following claims. He says that if there is a meaning to be found in mythology, it cannot reside in the isolated elements which enter the composition of a myth, but only in the way those elements are combined. So here what is not important are the isolated elements, but when these elements they are combined or they exist in relationship, that is when it becomes important. Now he says, although myth, this is second claim, although myth belongs to the same category as language, language in myth exhibits specific properties. So even though we say that myth is a language or it is a kind of language, you find that it exhibits very special or specific properties. And these properties can only be found above the ordinary linguistic level. This is why I said myth works on a higher level and it exhibits very complex features. Now, if we agree to these three claims, then this is the working hypothesis, he says, then we can come to the conclusion that myth, like rest of language, is made up of constituent elements or units. And these these constituent units, they presuppose the constituent units present in language when analyzed on other levels, namely phonemes, morphemes, and sememes, but they nevertheless differ from the latter in the same way as the latter differ among themselves. They belong to a higher and more complex order. For this reason, we shall call them gross constituents. So now it looks like language, he says, in its structure, what myth, and it operates on a higher, more complex level. So myth shares certain characteristics with language, that is, it is made up of units that are put together according to certain rules, and these units, they form relation with each other, and this relationships are basically they are formed based on binary pairs or opposites. Now Levi Strauss says that myths, they share a likeness with language, but they also are quite different from language. They differ from language because the basic units of myth are not phonemes, morphemes, but rather they are these units, constituent units called mythemes. Now, these structural components of myth, which Levi Strauss terms mythemes, they are not important in themselves. That is, they do not really have any intrinsic value of their own, but the meaning or the value depends on the structural alignment, how they are placed, how they are aligned, and this alignment actually gives them the meaning. And here every myth theme receives its meaning from its position in the myth and its relation with other myth themes. Now, Levi Strauss argued that myths could be studied to reveal or understand the universal oppositions, such as the dead versus living, nature versus culture, basically understand human interpretations of the world and belief about it as well. Now, according to him, mythical thoughts have always progressed from the awareness of opposition towards their resolution. And myth consists of elements that oppose or contradict each other, and other elements that mediate or resolve those oppositions. For example, in a story, you will have a villain and a hero, and there are other elements. It can be an object, it need not be a character itself, it can be any object or event that helps mediate or resolve the so-called opposition between the villain and the hero. So now after understanding what myth themes are gross constituent units. There is this question as to how are we going to identify and isolate these so-called constituent units, because they cannot be found among phonemes or morphemes. So then it is decided that we would look for these myth themes on a sentence level. But how to do that? That was a question, and then we arrived at an idea that we can only proceed by trial and error method, and this would be done by checking the principle, that is the basis of the structural analysis. All right, and it is made up of units that are put together according to certain rules, and these units, since they were put together according to certain rules, these units, they used to form relation with each other based on opposition, which I just spoke about, and this would provide the basis of the so-called structure. So now this is a technique that was used on page 211, breaking down the sentence or the story, the myth, into the shortest possible sentences or myth themes, and writing each sentence on an index card, and based on the similarities, they were given a sort of a number, and each card would show a certain function at a given time that is linked to this particular subject. Now, however, what was understood is that the constituent units on all levels were made up of relationship. And second, we find ourselves in the realm of non reversible time, since the number of cards correspond to the unfolding of the narrative. From all this, there is this new hypothesis that the true constituent units of a myth are not the isolated relation, but you find there is a bundle of relations, and it is only as bundles that these relations can be put to use and combined so as to produce meaning. So, this is the final hypothesis he arrives at. So, he says, even though myths are malleable, they are not bound by any fixed rules. So in order to solve this, they came up with arbitrary rules or structure. Now, based on the structural sameness. And Levi Strauss, he concentrates on these bundles of relationships or sets of relationship myths that they cuddle themselves into. So he broke down each version of myths into a series of sentences. So this is how it is done, consisting of relation between function and a subject. Now, sentences with the same function were given the same number and they were bundled together. And finally, what was found was that it is not just units but a bundle of such. There is a relationship, and it is only these bundles of relationship that is that would actually give meaning. Now, what does Levi Strauss mean by these bundle of units, bundle of relations? Now he has two comparisons to help explain, and the first being a futuristic, an idea that the archaeologists of the future coming from another planet, and they come to Earth and they discover that human life has already disappeared from Earth, and they happen to excavate one of our libraries. And even if since they come from another planet and they come from future, they are not aware, they do not have any idea about our writing, but that does not mean that they are ignorant. So they will be able to decipher it, and for this they have to there are a few requirements. For example, they have to discover the alphabet, and since we are in the habit of printing, they'll also discover that it has to be read from left to right and from top to bottom. And they would discover later on that there is a whole category of books that do not fit the usual pattern, and these would be the musical notes or the orchestra scores on the shelves of the music division. So you find these orchestra or the musical notes, and I'm sure you've seen the scores. Now, but after trying without success to decipher stuffs one after the other, from upper down to lower, they would notice that there is a pattern of notes, and they would recur at intervals. And it is these patterns that become important. Now, this is the musical score. This is the example of the musical score, and he talks about the treble and the bass clef. He says you can read music diachronically, that is left to right, page by page, and then you can also read it synchronically. And this is the pattern that they would discover by looking at the notes in the treble clef as well as their relation to the bass clef. And it is this connection between the treble and the bass clef notes that the harmony is produced, and this harmony is what Levi Strauss calls a bundle of relations. Now, the other comparison or example that he gives, a comparison is that with a person who plays card. And imagine there is someone who's playing the card, and there is an observer who does not really know how to play cards. But now he would know something of the visitors who come to who would visit a fortune teller. He would know something about the visitor, sex, age, physical appearance, social situation, etc. In the same way as we know something of the different cultures whose myths we are trying to study. Now he would also listen to the seances. Seances, like for example, if you visit a fortune teller, meaning a tarot card reader, uh, they would probably prophecy. They would go on talking about the supernatural experiences and whatnot. And a person who is not familiar with the cards, with the playing cards, that is, playing cards of the fortune teller, would listen to these seances or predictions, and they would record. The observer would record it and would be able to listen to it and make comparisons. Now he says, if the person who the observer is bright, and if the material, that is, if he has enough number of recordings of these seances of the fortune tellers telling, then he will be able to reconstruct the nature of the deck of cards being used. That is, out of the 52 or 32 cards, it is based on four homologous sets consisting of the same units. Basically, he needs to have enough number of sittings with the fortune teller, and by observing or listening to the seance sessions, he will be able to come or arrive at some kind of a reading of these so-called cards. And the cards which are divided, it can be classified based on similarities. So now he says, let's go to the next concrete example, and for this he uses the Oedipus myth. So now for the concrete example, we're going to use the Oedipus myth, and he says we are all aware of the Oedipus myth. Oedipus is also a prominent character, study in all schools of thoughts, and he delinks this narrative into myth themes, and each theme is ominous, and it is presented as an approaching tension. Now he analyzes each unit of tension in binary oppositions, and it is these binary oppositions which are binding factors that relate each myth. So now he is planning to illustrate without reaching any particular conclusion, and this particular myth is going to be treated like an orchestra score. That is, it is going to be read, it's going to be placed diachronically and synchronically. It's going to be read, and he says towards the end of page 213, we shall attempt to perform the same kind of operation on the Oedipus myth, trying out several arrangements of the myth themes. So we're going to place myth themes or these sentences in different patterns, different forms, till we arrive at one particular harmony, or till we discover some similar pattern or a tendency. Till then we're going to arrange. And I'm sure you can see this table over here. And before I get to this, I would like to introduce the main characters, because I am not very sure whether you know the story. I'm sure you know the story of Oedipus, but I'm not very sure whether you know the story of Cadmus. So I'll take that in the next class.
Of the king of Phoenicia Agenor and Queen Telephassa. He had two brothers, Phoenix and Cilix, and one sister, Europa. It is said that Cadmus was the one that brought the Phoenician alphabet to Greece. One day, Zeus saw Europa gathering flowers in a meadow near the seashore, and he fell in love with her. He transformed himself into a magnificent bull and galloped onto the meadow. The princess was dazzled by the beauty of the bull, that was white as snow, and his horns shimmered like jewels. The bull was so placid that Europa pet him and fed him with her hand. She was so fond of the beautiful beast that she climbed on its back. Immediately the bull jumped into the sea, and with Europa unable to escape, swam off to the island of Crete. Cadmus, Phoenix, and Cilix started looking for their sister, with Cadmus wandering all over Greece. Soon, he he arrived at Apollo's oracle at Delphi. The oracle instructed him to stop searching for Europa, as her fate lied in Crete, and instead she told him to follow a cow, then wandered away from the herd. At the point where the cow would kneel, Cadmus had to find the city. So when the cow finished her journey, she kneeled, and at that location, Cadmus founded the city of Thebes. Sometime later, Cadmus fought and killed a dragon who guarded Ares' fountain and enraged the surroundings of Thebes. Athena instructed him to see the dragon's teeth, and then as a result, grown armed men sprouted from the ground. Those men were named Spartians, but all of them killed one another, except from 5, which then became the ancestors of Theban people. Cadmus had to be cleansed for the killing of the dragon, and so he became Ares' servant for 8 years. As a reward, Ares gave Cadmus his daughter Harmony to marry. Cadmus presented Harmony with a famous necklace, later known as Harmony's necklace, forged by Festus himself. Athena also made a beautiful veil as a wedding present to the bride. Cadmus and Harmony had lots of children and lived happily as king and queen of Thebes.